Right, okay guys, in my hands we have the brand new CPU from AMD. This is the Ryzen 7 9700X, and that is going to get confusing because there's too many 9s and too many 7s. And I'll be honest with you, I've already done the opening to this video quite a few times, and I just don't really know how to set this up because this is going to be a big deal. This is an 8-core, essentially a great gaming CPU, has roughly 16% better IPC versus the previous generation. Don't worry, we'll be showing you full benchmarks. We're going to be building this epic gaming PC with an RTX 4090 to show whether this actually bottlenecks anything. And the problem is, we're expecting the performance of this to be very similar to that of the current generation 7800X3D, at least when it comes to gaming. If you're doing productivity, obviously you'll get different results. But my concern is that at the launch price at least, it's up against something that, as I say, is about the same, but costs less, because at the time of filming you can get the X3D for around about £330 in the UK, similar amount in USD. So if you're a gamer, do not go out and buy this without doing your research and paying very close attention to not only the benchmarks, but all importantly, that pricing information, because the context of this will completely change, right? These typically launch at, I don't want to say high price, but they launch their RRP. They tend to come down in price quite a lot. So regardless of the performance of this, do pay very close attention to the pricing and buy when the time is right. Okay? Got that? Really important. So join us as we walk you through the latest Ryzen CPU, all of the components that we have here today for this awesome 4K gaming PC, and of course, those all-important gameplay benchmark numbers so you can see exactly how this thing performs. So let's find out if this thing is any good, shall we? Right after a short word from this video's sponsor. Meet the new Gigabyte G6X, a crazy powerful yet affordable gaming laptop that oozes luxury. This mighty machine packs up to an RTX 4060 laptop GPU and an Intel Core i7 13650HX CPU, allowing you to dominate in your favorite titles. Combine this with a huge 16-inch 165Hz 16x10 display with ultra slim bezels, and you're going to fall in love with PC gaming all over again. Feast your eyes on this gorgeous laptop today with the link down below. Right then, the way that this is going to work is hopefully going to be pretty straightforward. So obviously we have our motherboard, and very important note actually is that at the time of filming, the new motherboards aren't out, which is absolutely fine. You can use any AM5 compatible motherboard as long as you updated the BIOS to the latest version. I think some earlier ones might work, but you're not going to get the best performance at the very least unless you update it. So please do that. And if you're buying one that has USB BIOS flashback like we have on this particular motherboard, it means you don't need an existing CPU to upgrade, which is great. So we're going to use this one, which is from ASUS. It's the X670E Plus Wi-Fi, but there will be future motherboards that will come out like X870 or B850. All these numbers do get confusing when they change. They're so ingrained into my brain, I apologize, that obviously we'll eventually replace these, but nothing wrong with using these all the time they're selling them. But yes, I'm very keen to get this out of the box, so shall we start with that? Now, I will be honest with you, I'm not expecting this to be drastically different to the previous generation when it comes to the unboxing experience. It is literally just a CPU in essentially otherwise an empty box. It's a bit of a shame actually that they don't give you a stock cooler with this, because I know they could afford to do so, and because this is now a 65-watt chip, it means that you're not going to need like crazy cooling. And this is probably the main advantage of this over the previous generation, which was the 7700X, which was 105 watts, or the 7800X3D, which was 120, because the performance of this is probably going to be between those chips. But especially if you are going to do like an ITX build, or you just want to save money and you don't want a crazy cooler, then it's great to see that you can now go for something that's still going to have epic performance. That's kind of an AMD joke, their server chips are called epic. Anyway, it didn't really work. It's great to see that you can have something that's still great in terms of performance, but also isn't going to like cost you an arm and a leg, and can physically fit into smaller spaces with smaller coolers. Actually, no, hang on a minute. There is a big change versus the previous generation. The box has slightly changed color. Look at that. But at this stage, many of you are probably wondering why we're going for an X670E motherboard rather than B650. And the honest answer is that actually there's not that much more cost associated with this particular X670E board versus B650E. And if you're going for especially one of these new CPUs at launch, I would say it is worth going for the E versions to get that PCI Gen 5. But if you are looking at maybe like a Strix B650E or something like that, you're maybe looking at what, like £30, $40 less than this. So if you did want to upgrade to have slightly more bandwidth, maybe more features, more USB, depends on the motherboard of course, then it's not a bad option because this is not crazy expensive. Remember of course that one of the key things you are looking out for is this BIOS flashback utility, so you should have a USB port that says BIOS and then a little button. It's called different things on different motherboard vendors, boards and things, but essentially they all work the same way. Just grab your motherboard and drop it down on top of the box. We're then going to open up this socket that says Tough Gaming, of course being really careful not to touch any of the pins. I know I sound like a broken record, but you touch the pins, your peril. well, chances are your CPU then won't work. Especially if you've paid launch RRP money for your, almost said 7700X, for your 9700X, you would be very sad. But yes, here is our CPU. It does look essentially the same look as all of the others, but that's absolutely fine as long as it does have the extra performance. And just want to lower this down into position, then close it back up, and of course, ping that down and get it safe and secure. Then we can move on to our male sheep, and today we have 2 sticks of 16 for a total of 32. This is going to run at 6000 megahertz, which is probably going to be optimal, but we can do some tests at a later date, as this way the memory can run at 1:1. This is a CL30 kit, so nice and low latency. But interestingly enough, whilst I'd usually recommend, and I do recommend, that you go for an Expo kit, the one we're using here today is an Intel XMP. So we will see if this works without any issues at all. I would guess that it will, but for better compatibility, go for Expo. But just push this down into position. Remember, of course, that this is a DDR5 board and you cannot put DDR4 memory in it, especially if you're upgrading. That one might catch you out. But just push it in until you get that click and you can move on to the next step, which is to open the door because it's too bloody hot. What's next? The SSD, the solid state drive. And as we always say, I would usually advise buying one on sale, because if you check now with my current pricing links listed down below, you'll almost certainly be able to find an SSD on sale. But today we're going for a really high-end one from Samsung. This is PCI Gen 4 990 Pro, among one of the fastest drives you can actually get. That is PCI Gen 4. Obviously this does support PCI Gen 5, which is great, but there's not really any reason to have it for a gaming PC at the moment. As soon as the drives do start to come down, then yes, there's nothing wrong with doing that, as long as it's not got a massive heatsink or a really loud fan. But at the time of filming, they are still too expensive really to recommend for gaming. So we're going to throw screwdrivers around. We're going to take this top slot off. If you haven't already, do remove the little bit of film that will appear on here, but obviously I've used this board before. Then you can just grab your SSD, line it up with the slot, and then these ASUS boards have these little catches to help you install them. Push it down into position, then you can grab the top and obviously put it back and replace it. And with that, our motherboard is now pretty much ready to go. So it's time to talk about cooling. And the reason we do this now before we actually put it inside our chassis is just to confirm the mount and the way that this is going to essentially fix to our motherboard. Because if we're going to need to unscrew these and put anything third party in, it's always easier to do it now. And you guys have been raving about this for a while actually, so I thought it's finally time to use it. Arctic sent this one out. It's the Liquid Freezer 3 360. You can get it in RGB or this black version. So today we've got the black version because we're going to be using NZXT fans and things, and I don't want to like complicate the system and have 2 things going on at once. And this is probably a bit cheaper. But let's open this up and actually see what we have. We have a box. Then we have a very large Arctic logo, which looks like the cover actually for this cooler. Don't think it has a fan in it. Oh, it does. Yeah, there you go. So it actually does the CPU socket as well. As long as this is quiet, fine. If this is loud, bad. And I love the trend now of actually having the fans pre-fitted to the cooler, because it really does save you a load of faff as long as you are using this in a standard configuration whereby it's exhausting at the top. And it does actually look like the cables and things all go through the tubes and actually into the pump head itself, which makes it a lot easier to install. Maybe we're going to love radiators today. But of course, we don't actually need the cooler at the moment, just the mounting mechanism. So we've got this little bag here, and it does indeed look as if we do have to remove some things from the motherboard, as we have the AMD brackets. Getting this installed though should be very straightforward. Just remove these 4 screws and these little plastic nubbins. Then grab these spacers and drop those on top of the holes. Lower down the bracket on top of those. Just fix it down into position. Okay then, with that out of the way, we can now press on to what is also a very exciting component. It's not really a component, is it? It's the chassis, it's the tower, it's the case. And today we actually have a brand new one for the channel. This is the NZXT H7. It's the new 2024 version. And to be fair, quite a few things have happened to this. And there's one thing that I don't like about it, but everything else so far pretty much looks good to me. So it's very easy to get inside. You've got nice, like, strong tempered glass panel, nice and thick, should obviously reduce some noise. And then, as you can clearly see, inside they've changed quite a few things. So the motherboard is almost a bit more recessed now. So your cooler is going to go up here, which gives you that little bit of separation. It's easier to get everything plugged in neatly at the top of your board. You've got this fan, I was going to say socket, fan channel, is that the right word? Positions for your fans, look, down the bottom, which again are recessed. And this is good because it again makes everything look cleaner, but the bad side is that I think this is going to look a little bit odd if you don't populate it. So it'll be fine for a bit, but if you want it to look complete, you are going to have to put fans down the bottom. You get 3 fitted as standard on this RGB version, and this is the bit that I don't really like. They've put like fans that are 120s, or you've got 3 blocks of 120s in a single block, which is cool. But then you've got all of like the gaps around it, and where you've got the mesh, it just looks a little bit weird to me. It looks like you've put fans that are too small for the position in. So you can put 140s here, but I just think they could have done a better job really to make this look nicer from the front. Bearing in mind this is something that's meant to look really nice. But anyway, we'll see what it looks like when it actually comes out. Maybe I will be mistaken. You've got mesh on the side as well. So when you do put your power supply in, you can see actually it's rotated to the side. So it breathes in here, which is what allows you to essentially have that recessed effect to the motherboard tray. So still plenty of room actually for all of your cables, and you can put like SSDs and things that you have that aren't on the motherboard, obviously around the back. Controllers, where it says place controller here, which is quite nice. And then ample cable management room, which is good. I've tested a lot of cases recently, and a lot of them haven't really thought too much about cable management other than giving you a few ties. So this is good to see. But let's kickstart our build by laying this down flat, picking up our motherboard, and of course, all of the standoffs are actually pre-fitted for you. It's very rare now that that's not the case, as usually on the more budget options, but just lower this down until that middle one catches the rest of the board. Then you can ignore everything PC Centric says, because obviously you need to grab your screws from the back, and that was not the right way round. Wow, well that clearly isn't the best way to have your screws kept anyway, is it, NZXT? I was also about to complain because they still don't say on the screws what they're for. They just give you the exact type of screw that they are. And NZXTs, they have 2 sizes. One's like really small, one's small but not quite as small. And even I get confused each time which is for the motherboard and which isn't. So if you've never built a gaming PC before, that's going to get really confusing. So please, NZXT, can you just write motherboard on the screws that you're using for the motherboard? It's not that difficult. Please. But once you have finished your internal monologue of stroppy behavior, you can get all of these screws fitted down. Whilst we're here, we can also switch things up a little bit and actually start to get our CPU cooler installed, because it is easier when it's on its side. Just make sure, as I say, that the fans are obviously blowing the way that you want them to, but they are pre-fitted correctly here for this orientation. Tubes on the right hand side, all of these little cables again on the other side so you don't see them. Then you just line this up, take the top off the case, then just get this screwed down. Then here comes the bit that's potentially a little bit more tricky, because this is unusual for a CPU cooler. You have these 2 little bars, if you like, that obviously hold the screws, and then the screws are already pre-fitted for you on this cooler. So we're going to take off this little warning sticker that obviously protects the underside for better thermal contact. We're going to pick up the thermal paste. We're going to add, I was going to say a pea-sized blob, but it's shot out there, so that's potentially a little bit much, but that's okay. And then we're going to pick up our pump head, remove that bit of plastic, and then I would imagine that this should just line up with these holes. I'm wondering if I'm doing something wrong, because that does not seem right. Ah, okay, right, I got it. I did make a mistake, I knew it, and that's why you read the manual, but they didn't give you a manual in the box, you have to scan it with a QR code. Essentially, these bits are upside down. I was close. So let's try that again, shall we? Still is a little bit fiddly, but easy to rectify. I'm not gonna say it yet. I'm sorry, but this mechanism is rubbish. Why is this so difficult to install? Oh, I'm actually really unhappy with this.
Why would they make it this difficult?
It's a shame, because one of the Arctic coolers I used not that long ago with the Intel backplate, this comes with one as well, it was actually really easy to install. So this has got to be one of the hardest CPU coolers I've ever had to install. Just so stupid, because it doesn't need to be that way. I might need a timeout.
I'm so angry at this.
I hate radiators. It literally doesn't do it. One side fine, the other does not go in at all. I don't believe it, we've done it. We've done it, everybody. We've done the most difficult CPU install I've ever done in my life. Editor Carl, can we please get the total time that took up on screen? Thank you very much. This is why, ladies and gentlemen, I absolutely hate radiators.
I cannot stand them.
Because you have to do stuff like this. They're all very different. Some are better than others, but everything seems to go wrong, and it's always the radiator. Ah! Let's hope installing this is a little bit more straightforward. It should just drop into place, right? Yes. We do also have to plug this in, of course, and we do have this little cable that goes underneath that pump. Then plug the fan headers in at the top, just above the CPU socket. Right, anyway, with that, we should now be at the point where we can actually add a few fans down the bottom, get our cables plugged in, and then actually get our graphics card, power supply, and be pretty much done. I'd like to think that the most difficult bit is out the way. Let's just hope it works properly. And actually, as with the front, the fans we're going for are just a single block. So these are the F360 RGB cores, and the idea is just that they're easier to install because, yes, okay, okay, having individual fans is always more flexible if you change case, but most people don't, and even if you did, obviously you're probably still going to have the same layout anyway. And obviously the alternatives are going to be to have individual fans that interlock together or use magnets, but then NZXT say this is actually cheaper to install, and then you can have this single light bar strip that goes all the way down the side, which is quite cool. On the back, you do have to use their proprietary connector, but yes, I do imagine inside the box, you do get a converter if you just want to split it into PWM for your fan and then addressable RGB. But let's feed our cable through first, and then we can just drop this down into position like so. And then as you can see, it perfectly fits the void. Oh, which means turning it on its side again and then getting that safe and secure. So now we should have a much more complete case, and you'll see what I mean about how if you don't populate the bottom, it will look weird. Now it kind of looks right, but obviously we will need to get these cables plugged in. So round the back, you always find like a big bundle of stuff. So just pick up and sort through your cables. You've got your USB 3, you've got your front panel audio that says HD audio on it. You've got your USB Type-C that annoyingly isn't reversible. Make sure it's plugged in the right way round or your PC can short out and not start. This happened to me the last PC I built. Really annoying. I didn't realize straight away. So be aware of that. Then you've also got your front panel connections again to get all of these actual buttons to work. Your fans, look, come in this proprietary connector and addressable RGB. Oh, okay, that's why I'm getting confused. It's fine. NZXT are just covering off both bases. They've got the NZXT RGB connector on one side and then addressable RGB on the other, so it's optional, you don't use both. And then you've got your fan speed, of course, to get it to work. I was gonna say that was a bit confusing without any adapters, but okay, let's get these plugged in. Our USB-C is located on the right-hand side of the motherboard, and the bottom one is USB 3, and then the one above that is USB Type-C. At the bottom right, we've got our front panel connection, and then all the way at the bottom left, we've got our HD audio. I'll add, by the way, that I was going to use this, which is the NZXT RGB and fan controller, which is useful if you want to control everything through NZXT CAM, but as we're trying to save ourselves a little bit of money, despite the fact that we've got 4090 in this, I don't actually think it's necessary because obviously you've got just 2 blocks of fans and this is a third-party cooler anyway, so there's nothing wrong with going for that, but we don't need to expand our system. We've got enough addressable RGB and fan headers on the board, so we can save ourselves a bit. We can save ourselves a little bit of money. Just obviously plug your fans and addressable RGB in down the bottom. But let's now press on to the power supply, and this is actually becoming a pretty popular choice on the channel. This is the A850GL. Now, personally, if I was building a 4090 PC, I would definitely consider going for 1000 watts just for a little bit of future proofing, especially if the rumors are true about the next generation of NVIDIA graphics cards needing essentially the full 600 watts, but we'll wait and see on that one. But this can often be found for under £100, and it does come with a PCI Gen 5 connector that can do up to 600 watts to the graphics card, which is all we need. And bear in mind actually that the CPU obviously is only a 65 watt TDP chip, then yeah, we don't need more. If you went for an Intel CPU or something like that and you were overclocking it and it was using like 250 watts, okay, I would feel uncomfortable with this 850, but otherwise you should be laughing. But let's see if this will fit, bearing in mind all of these cables are already here. Doesn't look great, does it? How on earth are you supposed to get that in then? Basically just plug the HD audio cable in after you put the PSU in. And then we're pretty much ready to rock and roll, because of course it's just a case of plugging in our RTX, our single 8-pin CPU at the top left, which is fiddly, but very doable in this case, as I say, because it's recessed. So again, marks to NZXT for that. Remove the slot covers from slots number 2 and 3 for the PCIe, and then complain that NZXT haven't used thumb screws, just these tiny little ones. And then of course I know the star of the show today is actually the 9700X, but let's be honest, if you've got a Founders Edition 4090 in your hands, that's always going to get you a little bit excited. So let's drop this into position, give it a push, screw it back down, and then you can pick up that Gen 5 connection, make sure it's the right way round, and then just push that in till it clicks nice and easily. And then, ladies and gentlemen, I think our rig is actually complete. What do you make of this? I mean, it's definitely very well themed, isn't it? I will say that there's maybe a little bit too much of a gap for my liking with this particular chassis, but overall, I quite like what we've got on offer here. And in terms of cable management, as I say, it's definitely worked really well. There's plenty of space to actually manage all of your cables, and I do like the fact that they have rotated this just to give you more room elsewhere in the chassis. Definitely makes sense, but obviously it is going to depend what you put on it. And I suppose I've only just realized, but it doesn't really matter, we don't have an additional fan here at the back, but that does mean you can see your motherboard in its full glory. So overall, I'm excited. Should we get this turned on? Of course, we need a monitor, keyboard, mouse, and the mighty PC-Centric mouse mat. Get yours today at pccentric.store, linked down below. And then first things first, before we actually update the BIOS, I want to see what will happen if we literally just turn the power button on. So let's get the top top of this back into position. We plug our mouse and keyboard dongle in, and then let's see what happens. Now, I would expect this to not work and to probably get like an error light on screen on the motherboard. Usually it's going to be like a red, sometimes it's amber like we have here. But yeah, we give it like a minute or two to essentially see if anything comes up on screen. But as I say, I'm not expecting this to work. And regardless of whether it does, you should absolutely update your BIOS to make sure you're getting the right and best optimal performance for your new CPU. I think we need to update the BIOS. So let's instead grab our USB flash drive, and I've gone to the manufacturer's website for this board. I've hit support, downloads, BIOS, downloaded the latest one, dragged it to the root folder of a FAT32 drive, that bit's important, and then run the BIOS renamer tool, and that should be good to go just by dropping this into the BIOS section, then holding down the BIOS flashback button until we get a light. And so now I've got a flashing green light. We just need to wait for it to go out. The light is staying solid, so it's not flashing, which usually indicates there's a problem, essentially. Right, everyone, don't laugh, but I think the problem was silly old me, because turns out there are two motherboards. One is called the X670E Plus Wi-Fi, and the other one that I downloaded the BIOS for was just called the X670E Plus with no Wi-Fi. So obviously it was a different BIOS file, it wasn't working. I was getting so angry, I was raging, I was trying to find the USB flash drive I always use that always works, couldn't find it, repartitioned the disk, changed like the boot record and things like that, and then I went, oh, is it definitely the right BIOS? And turns out the answer is no. So I've swapped it over, replaced it, and now it is working as intended. So essentially what you should get is a flashing green light on this Asus motherboard. It has worked every time for me before, which is why I was surprised that it wasn't working this time. And when it goes out, then you're done. But if you find that after around about 5 seconds or so, the light stays solid green, then that means that there's a problem with your USB disk or so. So I would still give it a little bit of time just to make sure you're not misinterpreting it. But yes, the flashing is quite obvious. So let's see what happens when this is complete. Oh, right, okay, I think we're there. The light has gone out, so there's only one thing left to do. Will our PC now work? Well, it lights up, which is always a good sign. New CPU installed, yes! Oh, the stress. Oh, hitting embargo is always really fun, isn't it, when things don't work? But it does look as if we are cooking on gas now. So what I'm going to do is obviously enable XMP on this system and get the fans tuned, all of the games downloaded, and we will be back with some performance numbers. And so then, ladies and gentlemen, a new day is upon us, which means it is now time to actually get into the weeds and start seeing just what this CPU can do. And I will say as well that the system as a whole, I think it looks really good from the side. It's very clean, it's minimal. If anything, this like little bit down the bottom is a bit too big, but one of the ways I think you could actually improve this is to grab something like this, which is a Fantex display, and this is magnetic and it will just sit down the bottom like that, and then you could like use this as a readout or something. Very unnecessary, but ultimately you've got a lot of space down the bottom that I think looks a little bit odd unless you populate it, but not too odd that I'd say it ruins the overall aesthetic. I still don't like the front of this though. The fans just seem too small and it kind of ruins it for me personally, but let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. Noise levels and things we'll get onto in just a second, but obviously because there is a fan inside the Arctic cooler, obviously you can turn it down, so it's not a big deal, but that is going to make a little bit more noise than normal, so be aware of this if you are going to go for this. But let's jump into some games. No, actually, we haven't done the peel. Oh, and they've got the bloody sticker still on the window. That's a solid 5.5 out of 10. You lose extra marks for this. Overall, I'd give that a 4. And I think the first title that we're going to start off with is some Cyberpunk, because obviously this is still the main ray trace title really out there. And what you're seeing now is what I like to call Overlay City, as we've actually got 2 up, because I want to see the latency as well as the frame rate and all of the CPU usage. So we're kind of getting the best of both here today. And as you can see, Cyberpunk does actually quite heavily hit the CPU when it comes to utilization, but this is definitely more something that's happened over time, and especially if you are going to use the ray tracing. So this is actually the top preset, although I have set the DLSS to performance, which actually it probably would do anyway if you set it to ultra settings. But anyway, this is 4K ultra settings, and as you can see with the 4090 we're getting a pretty decent frame rate of around about 85 to 90 FPS. Granted though, this is a 4090, so you might be thinking, is this game really that demanding with ray tracing that you can't get like over 100 FPS? The answer is yes, unless you're willing to use DLSS frame generation. So if we go into the video options, and DLSS frame generation will actually help to alleviate CPU bottlenecks as well, which is pretty cool because the frames will obviously be generated by AI between the rendered frames, so this doesn't require much of a CPU overhead at all. So it worked quite well in things like my memory fades me. Flight Simulator, that's not even difficult to remember. Something like Flight Simulator will really help, but here it should help as well. So if we turn this on, hit apply, and then go back into our game, we will see what happens to the frame rate, and yeah, as you can see, that's a massive improvement. And I definitely think as well that the higher spec the NVIDIA GPU is, the better the frame generation works. On a 4090, it's pretty flawless, but if you go down to something like a 4060, in my experience, it's okay in some titles, but in others, the latency essentially is just too high. Whereas what we had before is about 32 milliseconds of latency or so, and now we're at about 46. So this is an amazing way to play this game. It is so visually stunning, even without the path tracing turned on. But let's go into the settings once more and actually turn our path tracing on, which obviously is the most intense, most accurate way of having ray tracing. And there's no doubt about it that the game looks absolutely ridiculous when you turn this on. But obviously this does add extra latency into the system, and it is going to decrease your frame rate. And even with DLSS performance, we're now borderline for the limit for me when it comes to latency. I mean, I still think if I had this exact setup, this is probably the way I would choose to play it, at least for the most part anyway, unless we're like doing like, you know, some fire sequences or something like that. And as you can see, our utilization is actually fairly even among all of the cores. I think the first couple are maybe a little bit more heavily utilized, but yes, it doesn't look as if we're getting bottlenecking from this CPU. But Cyberpunk isn't. It's not that it's not the most intense, but as long as you have like a fairly modern CPU, I've not really found it to be a massive issue because the GPU is usually way more heavily hit. So unless you've got like a much older graphics card and a newer CPU or the other way around, it tends to balance out quite well. But obviously guys, this is a brand new CPU, so we do need to test it out in some much more CPU limited titles. And I think the best one really between something that is still modern enough to be very relevant, but then something that does properly hammer the CPU is this one, which is Spider-Man Remastered. And as you can clearly see, our utilization is very, very heavy across all of the cores. But if you actually look at the top left-hand corner of your screen, when it comes to the GPU utilization, you can see we're not actually able to fully utilize all of our 4090. And this is, I think, why a lot of people get confused. And fair enough, because it is very confusing, that the numbers don't always add up, right? Because you're not using all of your GPU, but then your CPU isn't at 100%. So is the bottleneck something else? Well, no, it is actually still the CPU. It just, as I say, you're basically looking for very high utilization on the CPU, and as long as that GPU is under, say, like 95%, then it usually suggests that you are getting a bottleneck from something, and that something is usually the CPU. So yes, this is running at 4K with DLSS set to balance, so it's a very heavy GPU load, but we do also have ray tracing on, and ray tracing does very heavily hit the CPU as well. That's also a common misconception. It's not just all about the graphics card, the CPU does also have an impact. So yes, we are getting some CPU bottlenecking here. But then I guess you could argue whether that really matters. I mean, if you're buying a brand new processor, then obviously yes, but actually for day-to-day gaming, I mean, if you're getting 100 frames a second or so, this is without DLSS frame generation, by the way, you know, do you need any more than that anyway? In something, I don't know, like Call of Duty Warzone, I get it because every FPS matters, but if you primarily are playing games like this, or at least these are the games that are being affected by the bottlenecking, not only do you probably not need to upgrade the CPU, but if you are going to, it doesn't mean that you need to spend the largest amount of money, right? But I would wager that if we were going for a 7800 X3D here, this would, as I say, be very similar, but I would not be surprised if the FPS was actually slightly higher. I mean, to be fair, the other easy way to actually see if you're getting any bottlenecking is just to turn the resolution down. So if we set this down to 1440p, we were getting around about 122 FPS. If you are getting a CPU bottleneck, then you would expect the frame rate to stay roughly about the same. And indeed, that is exactly what we've got. So even though we're now running this at 1440p, you can see the frame rate is pretty much bang on the same, actually. Obviously, slightly different scene now, and it's clearly more intense. But it's certainly not going up. It's between about 80 and 120 FPS. So yes, still getting a pretty big CPU bottleneck in Spider-Man on the on the 9700X. Okay, I was going to do an interesting intro about how, like, you're bored of single-player games and you want some multiplayer, but I'm in a two-way firefight at the moment. This is some Call of Duty Warzone, and obviously this is one of the most intense games on the CPU, actually. So this is probably the most important test, actually, for a lot of people. And as you can see, again, a lot of the CPU is being utilized. 8 cores is still going to be the sweet spot, as we've tested. If you want to see, like, the full video on how many cores you need for gaming, top right corner of your screen. But 8 cores is pretty much going to be optimal if you're you're using this as just a normal gaming PC and not doing loads of things on the side like streaming and things as well. And at the moment we are running this at 4K Extreme, DLSS balanced with frame generation turned off, because obviously why that's in the game in the first place. I think it's a branding exercise, it's stupid, don't add extra latency to your multiplayer game. Anyway, around about 200 FPS, so this is definitely faring very, very well at the moment. And importantly, our GPU utilization is around about 95, 96, 97% actually. So yes, if you're playing at 4K with the 4090, then you can get around about 200, 210 FPS before you run into bottlenecking. So the CPU is definitely doing very well here. But rather interestingly, as soon as we turn this down to 1440p, well, you can see exactly what has happened. We're now currently getting about the same frame rate, around about 5 to 10 FPS higher. So actually our bottlenecking was pretty much bang on the money at 4K, really well balanced. But as soon as you turn this down to 1440p, that happens. But also, yes, you are gonna, well, hit a CPU bottleneck really. So I don't want to say it's a shame, because if it's better than the previous generation, then great. But obviously the problem that we are running into here really is just all about price, because you can have a good product and it's not even necessarily priced wrong. Like the RRP is still going to be like the same or slightly less or slightly more than the previous generation. But when you can get the previous generation for way less money in terms of the market price, obviously it means that this is just a little bit of an odd choice. So yeah, it definitely is all about value for money really. Don't overspend on what is clearly a very good CPU, but it is still one that bottlenecks. So now comes that all-important time when I can hand you over to the most important man of the hour, everyone's hero. Let us know how much you love him in the chat. It is Bench Carl with the numbers.
Hello everybody, it's me, Editor Carl, and I'm here to run you through the numbers. Unfortunately, our testing sample size is pretty limited, as we had issues with the recommended motherboard and BIOS provided by AMD, so we had to start all over again yesterday afternoon. We also had to edit this video at the same time as benchmarking too, which took a lot of our time. Long story short, switching from the ASRock X670E Taichi to the Asus ROG Strix X670E-F with the latest BIOS fixed most of our issues. But AMD, please do us one favor and give reviewers more time to test these, and give us pricing details more than 45 hours before the embargo. It really affects the quality of what we can produce in the given time. But enough complaining about AMD and our issues. Let's take a look at the numbers, and I've got some good news for you if you're an owner of a 7800X3D, and perhaps some bad news if you are waiting for the 9000 series to truly blow you away. As you can see throughout our tests, the 7800X3D outperformed the 9700X in basically every gaming scenario, delivering higher 1% lows and higher average FPS across all our tests. I think many of us were hoping for maybe 7800X3D-like performance, but at a lower price. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems you'll have to wait for the 9700X3D, whenever that arrives, for a true bump in performance around this price point. After all those changes and alterations, our results still weren't perfect though, as the 9700X had 1% lows in Spider-Man Miles Morales. They were just way lower than the other Ryzen CPUs, and the drops in FPS were really noticeable and just something we didn't see with older chips. Taking a closer look at the 9700X versus the 7700X, there's not much to get excited about. The 9700X is only marginally better and perhaps not worth the £70 to £80 price difference. Like with all AMD CPU launches over the years, we will expect the price to fall a few months after launch, as it seems they're just looking to capitalize on early adopters. Now let's take a look at some of the averages, and we can bring in the i5 and i9 14th gen CPUs that we managed to test. Due to all the issues ongoing with the 14th and 13th gen CPUs, we can't really recommend them right now, but they can help to give a better idea of just how much the 7800X3D blows everything else out of the water. Don't worry, we'll have all of the chips in each game when we test out the Ryzen 9 CPUs. Now compared to the 9700X, the 7800X3D offers 10% more FPS at 4K and 12% more FPS than the 9700X at 1440p and 1080p. One of the good things about the 9700X is that AMD has managed to get it running at significantly lower power than the 7700X, 88 watts versus 136 watts of the last generation, though that 66 watts from the 7800X3D is just unmatched, despite its rated 120 watt TDP. Compared to what Intel has to offer, it's kind of a joke how far ahead AMD is regarding efficiency in the desktop market. Power consumption really isn't their friend at the moment. Another good thing about the 9700X is that the CPU doesn't just rocket up to 95 degrees and stay there. It behaves a lot more appropriately and manages to match the 7800X3D at 76 degrees. As a result of this, performance per watt is a lot more favorable for the newer 9000 series CPU, but it still falls way short of the 7800X3D. That CPU is such a beast. Now, the most important part, pricing or cost per frame. the 7700X is the champ when it comes to value because it's just so much cheaper. In the UK, the 7700X launched at £429 back in September 2022. It's now just £266. That's a 46% price drop. It's good to see that AMD has launched the 9700X at £329, £100 less than the 7700X, but with that much of a price difference, it can't really compete. The 7800X 3D offers a lot more FPS for about £10 less than the 9700X, so it's losing that battle too. The only real advantage for the 9700X and why you might consider buying one is for the lower power draw and better performance in single and multi-threaded work applications. It's worth mentioning that Intel CPUs are generally still a little bit better for multitasking and for tasks like photo or video editing, though that is assuming it's not crashing on you and you need to replace it. For gaming though, the 9700X just can't compete at its current launch price. It'll be interesting to see how much this price changes over the coming months though, so don't discount it just yet. Just wait for AMD to discount it.
So there you are then. Definitely very interesting stuff. And I will say as well that I've realized that we didn't have the CPU temperatures and we didn't do our acoustic test whilst we're doing all of the other gaming things. And the reason for this, again, not trying to hide anything, it just wasn't appearing in Afterburner because clearly like the newer CPU isn't compatible with something. Anyway, I'll show it to you now. So at the moment, GPU around about 63 degrees, clearly no issue there. Noise test. Really, really quiet system, especially bear in mind just how much power this is actually using. Very, very impressive. But in terms of our temperatures whilst gaming, we actually hit a peak of around about 75 degrees as we had NZXT cam running the whole time. So yeah, 75 degrees on a 65 watt chip with a 360, clearly not going to be an issue. But overall, I do really like this system. I love just how clean it looks. I think NZXT cases work really well with the Founders Edition, and the black CPU cooler actually integrates very nicely as well. I'd say the whole thing just looks really clean. That's the word that I would use. And obviously the cooler is also relatively affordable. So go for it, right?
Well, as you saw, it was an absolute pain in the bum to install.
And bear in mind, so many others are like way easier. I'm not sure if I could actively recommend this, but let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. What do you make of our overall system? What do you make of the 7900X? Will you be buying the new series of Ryzens? And of course, if you do want to see a full video on the Ryzen 5 9600X, that video will be coming in a couple of days' time. So get subscribed for that if you're not already. But thank you so much for watching this video. Smash the like button, get yourself subscribed. And as always, if you do want to check out current pricing on absolutely anything that was featured in this video, you can find everything linked down below with our affiliate links. And while you're down there, why not indulge yourself in the power of the Gigabyte G6X? This stunning gaming laptop hits the sweet spot of luxury look and feel, combined with powerhouse gaming performance and immersive Dolby Atmos audio. Its beautiful display has an incredible 90% screen-to-body ratio, and the RTX 4060 laptop GPU not only brings jaw-dropping frame rates, but also accelerates AI applications with a mighty 233 TOPS of processing power. Level up your battlefield today with the Gigabyte G6X. Learn more with the link down below. But thank you guys so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.